of 24 sessions in which we're doing a deep dive into permaculture. Permaculture is both simple and complex. And in some ways, what permaculture is trying to see the patterns, to see the generalities, and then to understand, obviously, that every actual situation is unique and different. So that's the sort of the simple and complex. And that we're also moving from patterns to detail, from the general and focusing in onto the specific. And I think one of the ways we can think about permaculture is as a pattern language. So in our first session, we looked at the ethics of permaculture, and we sort of took a look at a kind of an overview of this was a permaculture farm in transition, and what we saw in that was a switch from a monoculture system with a lot of external inputs to a polyculture system with almost no inputs. And that's the journey that we're on, and we're also trying to perhaps understand what the stepping stones might be, moving from our current starting point. So we want to move away from the monoculture. We want to move into a regenerative way of being. So and also I have mentioned, I keep referring this back, is that this PDC it's based on a book, and it's based on Bill Mollison's Permaculture's Designer's Manual. And I've said before that was written, but now it was written back in the 80s, and it didn't really feel they had the experience enough and defined it enough to begin teaching the PDC to 1991. But really, that first PDC was trying to convey the content of Bill's magnificent book, which I think is on the shelf behind me there as well. And it's case studies, and it's the observations of applying permaculture design in different contexts. And we kind of started to go through these underlying principles, which is what define what permaculture is, and where those ideas have come from. So I'm going to pick up from, actually, for week one, I think we started looking at this slideshow. I'm just going to carry it forward, and we're thinking a bit about how we go about approaching design. And by design, I mean that's the process with which we solve problems. Design is how we make our dreams come true. It's the process of moving from intention, from your imagination, what your long-term thing you would like to achieve, and then to actually break that down into steps and to make that happen. To make it happen in a truly regenerative and sustainable way. So we looked at this one. So again, it's an idea of this overall aim within permaculture is it has a policy of responsibility to relinquish power. So this process of permaculture design is, we're trying to create self-managing systems. We're trying to create long-term outcomes that don't require continual input from us. And think of the model, we started talking about forests and natural systems last week. The model of that forest that had grown on a sunken ship through a process of succession, is it done it by itself, and that's what we're trying to enable, if you like, is a transition, whether it's in whatever form that might take, but something that in the long term doesn't rely on us. The role of a beneficial authority is to return function and responsibility to life and people. If successful, no further authority is needed. So the permaculture design process begins with taking responsibility to say, let's do something about this, initiation. So that's what it means by taking authority. But if we are to do that really successfully, we want to do it in a way in which we can return that authority back to the people again. We're trying to create self-organizing, self-managing systems. And we might have to do some interventions and planning to start that process. But that's our role as a designer. Okay, so this comes on very early on in Bill's book, and this is, I think, something to think about is the nature of the resources that we're using in our designs. And Bill put this summary together, which I thought was interesting, that we could think about resources, think about the things that we use, and Bill breaks them down into 5 categories. So have a think about what these might be. Examples. There are some resources that increase with modest use. There are some kinds of resources unaffected by use. There are those which degrade if not used. So if you don't use it, you miss your opportunity. There are those that are reduced by use. They're used up as you use them. And there are those that pollute or destroy other resources if used. So think about what those 5 things are. And then let's just jump into this image of 2 lovely illustrations from the designer's manual, in which it's thinking about how we produce an egg and contrasting a natural system with chickens foraging around in a designed kind of food forest, meeting their own needs, compared to this industrial system where but its footprint, the backstory of everything that's happened to produce it is so very different. So, okay, let's say that an egg is an example of a resource that if we don't use it, it decays. So there's no advantage in not eating, saving them for hatching. Chickens lay a surplus of eggs. So to not eat that egg doesn't achieve anything because it's a resource which those which degrade if not used. So we're going to design a system that is going to produce. Well, and also I'm looking at this tree. It looks like a Leucaena or a Tephrosia or something like one of those trees with lots of seed pods, maybe a nitrogen fixing tree. And then think about how those seeds are dropping down and the chickens are eating them. And therefore, again, they're unaffected by use, aren't they? We can just keep eating and keep being replaced. You get the idea. Now, there's other kinds of resources which, again, we see, look, we built our hen house. We've got a steel gutter. We've got some mesh there. We have to understand involves making steel, involves coal mines and iron ore and steel works and enormous amounts of energy. This picture kind of optimistically supposes that some of that energy could come from wind turbines, could be sustainable energy. And then, of course, contrasting that to the industrial system where animal feeds are processed and transported huge distances, factories and intensive methods of production mean that there's an enormous resources that pollute or destroy other resources if used. And also the iron ore and steel is reduced by use. It's used up. So in terms of our approaches to design, is we want to be working with I really want to prioritize working with materials that need to be used. Okay, that's Clovis trying to phone. I don't know if anyone can reach him. Maybe you could, Gerald. Anyway, we're trying to design and build systems from resources that are genuinely renewable. We want to which are wasted if we don't use them. I mean, that's the top of our list. And the more local, the more natural those materials are, the easier they are then to replace and to work with. And and also, if we've finished using them, we can compost them. That can return to soil. So this is so much of a different story behind our two eggs, and thinking about how that relates to the resources, what we might call the used up energy, the embodied energy, the embodied materials, also technology and ideas. The more high tech we are, we might have to be paying licenses or using specialist people to do maintenance. There's many considerations in our design approach. In permaculture, if we're looking for a system that can self-organize, a system that can sort of fertilize itself and manage itself to a greater or lesser degree, then everything that we're interested in is in the right-hand picture. Okay, so another one of the founding ideas that we had in the lecture, in the first lecture, was Bill Mollison gave us this idea that everything gardens. Now, again, we're thinking about how we approach design. We're thinking about how we work with nature. That's what we're trying to do. Work with nature so that we can create self-managing and self-organizing systems. But wouldn't that be cool if you had a garden that was kind of self-organizing and self-managing? Okay, maybe that's hard to achieve, but let's think about the stepping stones that might get us closer to achieving that. So, what are you doing when you're gardening or when you're farming? Is you're making choices, aren't you? You're promoting the conditions to support certain kinds of plants, and then you're editing out, removing other kinds of plants. You're doing weeding, you're doing sowing. You might be doing mulching, feeding with compost, doing things to reinforce one thing and to suppress another. So that's gardening. That's making small modifications to the environment around you, and that's slowly then the whole system that you're interacting with, if you like, you reinforce the outcomes that you want. And that's a fairly continual process. Well, chickens do that. Chickens do that when they're scratching around and turning. They're performing functions that's happening within gardening. So the question then is, can you manage or use or harvest the energy of that chicken so that that's scratching and turning, eating insects, eating larvae, and obviously producing eggs and other chickens, is you can use that action as part of your management system. So we've got some nice little examples here where obviously where a chicken here is doing digging work, and considering how browsing animals moving through natural systems effectively do pruning. They nibble at branches, and plants, trees, shrubs, they're adapted for that. They can withstand a bit of pruning and being browsed. And in fact, that pruning action lets in more light to the understory and allows other plants to grow as well. So think about how actually a lot of the actions and the work that we do when we're farming and gardening is replicating the things that would have been done by wild animals if it was a wild system. So there's an exploration in permaculture between, look, we've got grazing rabbits, mowing, doing function on one side, and then on the other side we've got somebody mowing by hand or with a scythe. We've got somebody digging by hand in a garden. We've got the chicken, digging in its foraging action. Ducks and geese mow and manage grasses, And then we've also got different assemblies of plants, either randomly put together by nature or put together by the farmer. So let's use this slide and use the ideas within the idea of everything gardens to think about how the actions that you're doing on your land and in your farming and growing techniques in some ways are replicating natural processes that would happen out in a natural system with in a semi-wild system, and and the more that we can sort of integrate those functions together, then we can start to benefit from the work maybe done by pigs digging or chickens scratching, and so forth. But also remember how it is, what the processes that are going on. Every single element in a wild system is in some way contributing to that system. It's gardening. They are making choices, reinforcing some things, inhibiting others. It's an important idea. When we look at nature, when we think about how nature operates, what we realize is that there are lots of elements working together to fulfill a sort of a bigger function. So in our little chicken system, we've got the tree providing shade and returning humidity to the air and dropping seeds that the birds can feed. Bird droppings help nourish the soil, which in turn feeds the tree. That there are relationships there. And that set of relationships between living things in a system is called an ecosystem. And I think we've all kind of heard that word together before. And this is how, again, the permaculture approach, it wants you to think about your garden, your crops, your field, however it is that you're cultivating, relating to it is, we want you to think of it, what you're doing is you're building an ecosystem. You're not just growing onions, because you're thinking about, well, there's certain things that might like to eat those onions. There are things that might like to eat the things that might eat the onions. What's the relationship between them? What are their needs? So let's just think about how characteristics of ecosystems, and again, Bill has given us to think about, to really go away and to contemplate how ecosystems are dynamic. That means they're constantly moving. Everything's kind of eating everything else. There are these all sorts of different interconnections, and almost like a spinning top. I think Bill said it in that there's a dynamic equilibrium in nature. And by that, Bill meant it's sort of like riding a bike. It's never perfectly upright, is it? You're going forward, so you've got momentum, but you're going over a rough road, potholes, and your weight is moving as you cycle. And it's that the combination of your wobbles sideways and forward that create that dynamic equilibrium that mean you don't fall off. So, and again, think about how nature shifts its balance. That there's a kind of an ebb and a flow, and over time that creates an equilibrium. Nature, we see, is typified by random assembly. And this is a very interesting, this is our first approach to design, is don't really do anything, don't really do any design. Assemble the useful components, identify the components that you want, and allow them to combine randomly. Let's see a little bit of chance. Excuse me a second. Or to allow a process where a certain amount of chance and randomness is allowed to happen. That if we, and of course, what happens in nature, in ecosystems, is a seed is blown, a seed is deposited by droppings or falls through gravity. It rolls to a place. if it's suitable for germination, that seed will grow, and if it isn't, it becomes food for something else. But once that random assembly started to take hold, it then very quickly becomes structured. The trees might shade out other plants, or animals might start, birds might start interacting with it. Some plants might be more successful or create certain kind of conditions. So, however a system might start, it will evolve. It will change, and the elements within it will interact. And there's much to be learned from observing those processes. As an ecosystem evolves and develops, slowly, more and more niches open up. By niches, I mean different special kinds of habitat. So just very simply, as a tree grows, there's a sunny side and there's a shady side. There might be a hotter side, or a drier side, and a wetter side. There might be a plant or a lichen or an insect or another organism that prefers the specific set of conditions. I like it slightly hotter. I like it a little bit cooler. These are niches. And you can imagine as the tree grows, there's then opportunities for birds to nest in it, or lizards to hide in it. And so as ecosystems evolve, there become more and more niches open up. And then what happens is species will find those out, seek them out, and occupy them. And slowly, that ecosystem will become more complex. And within that, there will be what we call trophic levels. These are energy levels. By trophic, we mean energy. And we'll see lots of examples of this. So don't let the terminology frighten you. So we've already made this very clear, is the only new energy coming into the system is coming from the sun. So the first trophic level is always plants. And it's plants that are catching the energy of the sun, translating it into carbohydrates and sugars and starches and everything else, and then providing a surplus, providing a yield that can nourish then the next trophic level, which are the organisms that live off the exudates from the tree, they eat the leaves, they and so on and so forth. So these are 5 things to bear in mind in understanding what is an ecosystem, what are its characteristics, and that there's a process over time, because they're dynamic, and might begin from a random assembly. They evolve, they become structured, they open up many more niches, many more species come in and join in, and you end up then with a multiple trophic level system. And the more levels, the more interactions within that system, the more stable it becomes. Or that's the exploration, is it seems to grow in stability up until a sort of an optimum point. And again, this is what we learn through observation. So you can allow a little bit of random assembly in the corners of your area that you're working in, and see how things evolve and identify these steps. So it's very important concepts, and we shall keep these in mind as we talk about design. So here's a landscape. This is a picture from Bill Mollison's Designer's Manual, and I'm not going to spend just too much time on it, but he's encouraging us to look at this landscape and see how there would be different conditions, different sets of niches at different parts of the different landscapes. So we've got the steeper slopes, which are forested. We've got streams and wetland coming down into the bottom here. We seem to have we've been encouraged to just see this grid here. We're also started to think about your ecosystem in a 3-dimensional way, and how we've got there's the rhizosphere, there's the area, the realm that's within the soil, and then we come. We see 4 layers of cultivation potentially here. So instead of just thinking like flat, I've got a field of maize or something kind of simple, is Bill's beginning to think about how layered, 3-dimensional ecosystem might be, how the conditions within it might change as we move through it. He's also encouraging us to think about how wildlife might interact with the system, how linear things might interact with that land, how animals and birds might pass through the system, and how you might choose to interact with them or to support their functions or harvest some yields or activities from them. So as we move through this landscape, we have this legend here which says species assembly variability, zonal variability. So you can see how we have a different choice of species that we have planted in the conditions down at the bottom, at the foot of this. And as we move through the landscape, we have schedules of residence. So there's a time factor as well. This is really interesting. Look, so here, look, we've got wetland, we've got water with ducks on it. We've talked about this interaction with both perhaps with farmed animals, but also with wild animals, and to think about how there's a time sequence to this as well. Animals might visit the water and drinking different times of the day. So we've got a time stacking, we've got space stacking, we've got different niches and different species assemblies as we move through the system. So these are all things to be borne in mind. We're trying to think big picture. We're trying to take the patterns from nature and then bring them in and use them for design. And of course, with design, you've got to see a sequence, maybe have an end result in mind, but also the steps which might get you there. So this is the beginning of our holistic thinking and planning, and this is a really nice illustration to help us think about that. Trophic levels. This was another one of our ecosystems key things. So look, thinking about the different niches and the 3-dimensional nature and structure and shape in space and time and sequence of use. And then think about the different relationships on these trophic levels. So look, here's our plant layer. And in proportion, Bill is suggesting that maybe 10,000 kilos of grass translated through locusts, frogs, fish translate to a 1 kilo 1 kilo of fish to the person. Sorry, of let's see, order of change of higher levels. So okay, yeah. So we've obviously there's a loss at each level, and we can only each trophic level can only support so many members. There's always going to be an energy loss between the food that you eat and the energy then that your body's able to retain. So as we move higher up the trophic level, the trophic pyramid, there's going to be fewer of each item, of each the species at each level. Let's get the words right. So here's a nice little picture here. The sun supplies the energy. Here's the energy coming in, being translated by plants. It's being eaten by the elements in the system. The plants are translating that energy, feeding the soil, and then obviously feeding the insects, feed the frog, feed the fish, feed the person. We're reminded that it isn't really a pyramid. It's more complex than that. We always end up with a food web, but because a lot of species are omnivorous and they can eat at more than one level or 2 or 3 of the layers of trophic levels. But so again, we're encouraged to think about those relationships and think about how for a fully functioning system, we need all the trophic levels, and those trophic levels can occupy many different niches, and there can be many different connections between the elements in that system. Okay, so we're getting our basic concepts on board here. Now, we're in Bill Moller. We're looking at, this is Bill Mollison's work. These are the founding ideas, approaches to design. We're going to get to methods of design, which is this topic this week, but also a reminder that permaculture actually had 2 originators. The other one being David Holmgren. And David Holmgren's way of summarizing permaculture was to distill it to 12 principles. And principle 1 was observe and interact. And the first 2 weeks of the PDC, I've really tried to think about observe and interact. This is how we're beginning our process of learning. And I'm encouraging you to observe and interact with this information and go out and try it out for yourself and read around, watch some other videos. Principle 2, and we're moving into thinking about this, of David's principle number 2, is catch and store energy. We're learning, we're teaching, we're sharing knowledge. That in itself is an energy. We're building relationships and friendships. We're building a peer group around permaculture. That's an energy we want to catch and store. But there's nothing more important than water. And in our methods and approaches to design, one of our absolutely fundamental things that we need to think about is, well, water is the ultimate limiting factor. If we don't have water, we have nothing. Or if we have a landscape, look here, we have an example here, that maybe there's a seasonal rainfall, maybe there's plenty of water at certain times of the year, but we can see that it would drain out of this system very quickly. And what happens? Cultivated landscapes, deforested landscapes, overgrazed landscapes, is they dry out and they drain faster and faster. And 2 things happen when this happens. One is, of course, you get drought because the landscape becomes more and more dry, more and more arid. The other thing you get is floods, because when it does rain, the water doesn't stay around. The rainwater doesn't stay around. It floods out through the system, and then lower down the valley, we've got too much water. This is a major problem. You will all recognize that, especially you guys in East Africa, but the landscape is slowly drying out. And yes, there's climate change. Yes, there's long-term factors affecting that, but there's short-term factors affecting it too. And it's the way you're farming, it's the way you're removing trees, it's the way you're compacting the ground. All of those things make a difference. So how would we catch and store energy in looking an example of looking at this? We've got a valley system. I hope you can see that. We've got a 3-dimensional view of a land, and there's drainage rivulets coming off this in all directions. Well, look, in this diagram, we can see really how the water is entering the system and leaving it as quickly as in as straight a line as possible. Here's the principle. This is what we want to do in permaculture, is we want to make that water do work. We want to make that water travel and nourish the system. So look how, in principle, what we want to make it do is to go sideways, not downhill. How can we work with water to keep it as close to contour as possible? This is a design principle in permaculture. And this is called a keyline system. And what we're looking at here is how, instead of allowing the water to drain downhill, a series of interconnected dams that fill up and then overflow, and fill up and overflow, and send the water by the longest journey possible, and intercepts the rivulets and the flows that are coming off the hillside, slows it down, put it into dams. Each dam can contain fish or ducks or water plants, or if it be for irrigation, but to connect together the whole valley so that it operates as an interconnected system. We design to catch and store energy. These are the core ideas that we need at the forefront of our minds as we think about problem solving using permaculture design. So we get to the chunk of what I wanted to cover this week, and I'm also going to do a lecture on soil. So we're going to the first half of this evening's time is going to be spent up on this, thinking about design and really exploring Bill Mollison's, the first three. Well, we're looking at the first three chapters of Bill Mollison's Designer's Manual. It's a heavy book. There's a lot of information in it. So I'm trying to bring this to life as much as I can for you. Here's a definition of permaculture from the book. Permaculture design is a system of assembling conceptual, material, and strategic components in a pattern which functions to benefit life in all its forms. It seeks to provide a sustainable and secure place for living things on this earth. It's quite a big statement. We've had a few different kind of definitions of permaculture. You can see how it depends whether you want to zoom into the detail of it or take a sort of a bigger picture. So permaculture design is a system of assembling conceptual, that means ideas. That's what we're doing here now. We're assembling concepts, we're assembling ideas, and then we can look at material and then strategic components, which we can then arrange in a pattern which benefits life in all its forms. So let's just go back a second and think, well, if we were to slow down the passage of water through this system and create a series of interconnected dams and ponds and soakaways, then nature's going to benefit from that. Birds are going to benefit from that. The migratory animals passing through the system are going to benefit from that. Plus, you're going to have the opportunity to build lots of yield to feed yourself, feed your family, feed other elements of your farm system. So this is for the benefit of all things. So this is good to just be reminded. Okay, functional design. This is methods of design in permaculture. We design to fulfill function. Doesn't matter what it looks like. Does it do the job that we want it to do? That's the most important thing. And also, can we achieve that with the minimum amount of resources? Functional design sets out to achieve specific ends, and the prime directive for function is, every component of a design should function in many ways. Just thinking about our little pond system that we had the example there. Think about how many different ways that would contribute to the design. Reduces drought, reduces flooding, supports farming and agriculture, develops yields of its own like fish and ducks, and also supports wildlife, migratory birds and animals. Multiple benefits. Every essential function should be supported by many components. This is how nature makes things resilient, makes it tough, is each function is supported by many elements. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you a very good example is, think about how important decomposition is, biodegradation, the fact that organic matter degrades and turns back to compost. Well, worms help break that down, don't they? And beetles and insects and larvae and numerous microbes and fungi. Those are all decomposers, and they combine together to, sort of take the organic matter and turn it back into soil again. That function, the process of composting and degradation, is essential, and therefore it's supported by many different elements. So this is, we'll recap on these ideas. We'll come back to these ideas multiple times. But these are key thoughts. Every component of a design should function in many ways. Every essential function should be supported by many components. A flexible and conceptual design can accept progressive contributions from any direction and be modified in the light of experience. Design is a continuous process guided by the feedback of its own evolution. I kind of think those last two statements almost say the same thing. That basically what it's saying is let your design evolve. Because I'll guarantee whatever you do, it won't be perfect. And you'll obviously be starting at the beginning. And as you move into it, you'll learn things. You'll realize things. The experience will educate you. So you need to be flexible and in your concepts, and think about how progressive contributions from any direction. So lots of different people might contribute to that. Some of those contributions might come from wildlife or from the wind or from by accident, by random assembly. You're reminded design is a continuous process guided by the feedback of its own evolution. So look, here we go. Deborah Aluka, our sister Deborah, is building Lorena stoves. She's making clay block stoves, working with communities around her. Is every time she makes it, they're never exactly the same because she's got slightly different materials, maybe doing it in a different person's house. And you're learning as you're doing it. So you also, your design is slowly evolving. That's permaculture. That's how we want to think in permaculture. Be flexible, but also to allow our designs to evolve. The key. So you notice that we're doing a lot of thinking, methods of design. We're doing a lot of thinking before we actually do anything. And what we like to say in permaculture is you make your mistakes on paper. Make your mistakes, practice, make models, do it on small scale, start small, and allow it to grow. So to use analysis, now we're going to come back to this, right? When we come later on to the third term, the third section of this course, we'll be doing our own designs. And you're going to be coming back to these notes and thinking about it, Dan. And I'll give you some summaries as well. But we're going to do analysis. We're going to design by thinking about the characteristics of each component. Like a chicken. Let's break down and think that if we were designing a system that included chickens, we need to understand what the needs of that chicken are. It needs shelter. It needs somewhere safe to roost at night. They like dust baths. They eat stones, don't they? Grit to help them digest chew their food and their crop. They obviously air and water and food. They need the other chickens as companions, as part of their for grooming and all the other sort of things that they do. Let's think about their behaviors. We already talked about chickens scratch and turn. They fly around, they fight, they give off manure, feathers, meat, eggs, carbon dioxide. All of these are potential yields. All of these are things that you could design into your system. That's what we mean by design by listing the characteristics of components. Think about the needs of goats or bees. Think about the needs of your growing system. And think about how, so this is the analysis. We just think about that, break it down. How can things self-regulate? Outputs, yields and benefits are all resources to be explored, are all resources. Sorry, yields and benefits are all resources to be explored. In other words, the fact that chickens like to scratch and turn the ground could be it could be damaging, it could be a problem, but it could be explored as part of the yield. If a chicken tractor system, a chicken arc system, where you perhaps utilize the chickens as part of your management system, then you're harvesting that behavior. Pollution is an unused output of the system. So there's an interesting thought to think that if we don't manage the manure of the chickens in a positive way, it could be a use. It can be a really useful resource, chicken manure. But let's say if you don't manage the chickens right and you keep them contained too much and allow the manure to build up, then that can become a source of illness or become a problem. So unused resources can become pollution. Interesting. Inputs, needs and demands. Inputs, needs and demands create extra work if not designed for. So there's an interesting idea. Let's just pop back to our chicken system. And look, in this system, we know that the chicken needs water. We've designed the shed so that there's a water catchment, there's a gutter there and a container which is going to capture the water, which can be then available there for the chickens. So the chicken can meet its own needs. In this system, the chicken's cage, it's contained, so it's not in a condition able to meet its own needs. Now, I have to come away and I have to carry away the manure, otherwise it becomes pollution, and I have to bring water to the chicken because it's not able to get it for himself. So I'm now working for the chicken. So here's the thing they like to say in permaculture, is that work is a symptom of bad design. So you're building up your permaculture system. Yes, that's going to be work to build up and initiate something new. But when it comes to maintaining it and running it, if you're running around like busy all the time, you haven't got it right. You need to take some time out, make some changes to the system. How can elements in your system meet their own needs? These are our ideas behind permaculture. This is what we're trying to get into thinking. And we're going to use analysis to understand the difference between the inputs, the needs and demands of an element in a system. Okay, I'm just going to pause a second, and I've been going for nearly an hour, and I hope everyone is following okay. So, on this journey, we're thinking about how we approach design, and we're thinking about the method that we're going to use. And this is central to permaculture, because in permaculture, we're trying to think how to create change in the world, but change in the world that's sustainable, regenerative, beneficial, good for us, good for community, good for nature. That's what we're trying to achieve. So let's look at this. Our design, whatever it is that we're applying our attention to, is going to be a beneficial assembly of components in their proper relationships. Okay, think that chicken system again. Think about the relationships within that, how the shed catches the water, which then feeds the chicken, how the manure from the chickens can be cycled into the food forest. Think of all those, a beneficial assembly of components. Okay, so now let's just might consider what those components might be. We have 4 headings. There's the site components. That's the physical place that we're at. So you need to have an understanding of that and do like an audit of that. What are the site components? We've got water, earth, landscape, climate, plants. What's there? And you go, that's your basic, we're building our relationship with the natural world. Energy components are what technologies might we need, are there structures, sources of energy, connections. What social components? We're also thinking about our relationship to other people. Do we need other legal issues? Culture, how does it relate to culture or trade, finance? And then there might be abstract ideas, certainly ethics, timing, information and data. So as we approach thinking about design, our design method is we're going to assemble these components in their right relationships. And we understand that that's going to be a mixture of what's physically there on the site, on the land, what's there, the energy, technologies, buildings that we might either have or need. And we're going to think about the social components around it. And we're also going to think about anything kind of abstract as well. And our design needs to speak to all of those areas. So again, as we go further into this, we're going to give you like a model, a way of thinking of problem solving, so that we can design in this way. So then we talked about analysis, input and output analysis. So think nothing exists in isolation. Every element, whether it's a tree, whether it's a chicken, whether it's a building, even it's going to need inputs to maintain it, to build it, to feed it, to make sure it's still there tomorrow, and it will also have outputs, and it might have products and behaviors, all of which are part of the total yield of the system. We're trying to bring all of these thoughts together when we design. There's some lovely illustrations in the designer's manual in Bill Mollison's book, and I guess they're kind of Australian, which was where he was doing his work in the initial phase, and they perhaps give us some really nice visualizations, perhaps, of what a permaculture transition in a certain context might look like. I guess on the left, he's called it a typical small farm. There's the farmer, there's a truck, he's obviously, he's got his vehicle, and he's got, every element is separate. We've got a cow and sheep in this here, we've got a little polytunnel, looks like some chickens here, that looks like the house, and then we've got some fields, orchard, an energy system. And that looks like a water thing there. Okay, nice. Okay. So here's our redesigned small farm. Oh, look, and we've got some other little things around here. Look, there's the rest of the community. So here's how can I do this? Oh. Whoops, sorry. Oh yeah, I can zoom that in a little bit. Let's have a look now. How has this changed? Well, he's put a solar porch on the house. There's the house. So we've got a solar porch on the house, maybe help heat it in the winter. We've given up a little bit of land to create a car park here, so that people from the community can come. We have an enterprise now. We're running out of this house, an earth bank. We have fruit sales, little kiosks selling produce. Into this paddock, we now have trees, fodder trees for the grazing animals as well. We've now got intensive veg growing all around the house. We built another house, and look how we've intensified the orchards. We've got a lot more going on, a lot more trees, a lot more complexity, look how we've got a fodder living fence, living hedge along the outside now instead of a fence here. This car is now part of a car sharing pool, and anyway, lots of nice ideas to think about how, and in looking at this picture, we're thinking about how these elements, these cattle, are now being used usefully to look how they're pruning the trees. They're harvesting any surplus more efficiently. We've now got multifunctional edges which can be browsed by the animals, but also better for wildlife. We've created more space for people. We've improved the growing. So we've got also is the resources that the people need are right around where they are living. So we can harvest the work from the people to manage the gardens. We can have good composting and food cycling things going on. And yeah, it's a lovely little view of what that transition might look like. And we've got, oops. Oh, I see. Yeah, right. And we've got plan of that system as well. It can help us understand it. Look how we've moved from, here we go from the one system. We've just got a pond, a windmill, a shed, a sheep and cow field, simple main crop, and an orchard. So yes, this is a separate system. This is the non-integrated system. And then here's the design. Look at this, how we've turned this rather dead-looking pond into something that's much more natural. It's got nesting islands and ducks and things on it. We've got supporting species all around it. We've got a duck foraging system, vegetable garden, orchard and chickens and bees integrated together, plus beneficial interplantings. The chickens are now part of a chicken foraging system. We've intensified this orchard as well for chickens and bees. We can put in sheep occasionally. So you can see, you can begin to deconstruct, to think how would you go about in design moving from the unintegrated to the integrated system. And you'd have to consider each element in that. We've got orchard, we've got the chicken, we've got the bees, we've got the ducks, we've got the sheep, we've got the cows, we've got the, each one of those elements. We're going to, and we've got the people. We're going to think about the inputs and outputs of those people, and we're going to design for them. Okay, I'm trying to stimulate the imagination, which we're thinking about how we're going to approach design in permaculture. So we've got another little checklist. Observation. Design by expanding direct observation on site. So the more time you spend on there, we were always told, I remember from my permaculture course, we were told observation takes at least a year. You've got to see the seasons. You need to see what the land's like when it's hot and dry, or when it's wet or cold. You need to see it at different times of the year, and with different flow cycles of vegetation. In your observations, be almost childlike with a non-selective approach. Allow the asking of fundamental questions. Like, why do we even do that? Why do we even grow matoke? Why do we even grow maize? I don't know. Ask fundamental questions to check that it's still the thing that you want to do, or who knows, there might be something better to do. It's good to observe by themes. How does water move through the land? What's water like when it's really wet and when it's really dry? When we've had a heavy rainfall, what happens to that? What happens when it hasn't rained for a while? We could think about food systems, think about energy, think about, as themes, because we want to have a interconnected systems that can run to a degree on feedback and self-regulation, so that we don't have to do lots of work. Part of our observation can be an instrumental approach. We can measure things, we can collect data, we can use that A-frame to measure gradients, we can think about the wind, the sun, or any other things that we want to quantify, obviously temperature. And our other part of our observation is just experiential. How is it for you? What does it feel like? Don't ever be, don't ever fail to value your own perceptions and your own feelings and experiences. I think that's a very good, so think about these all aspects of observation, asking you to design by expanding direct observation on your site, on the thing that you're engaging with. Be childlike, ask fundamental questions, approach it from themes such as water, energy, food, money. You could think about it in different ways. Can you measure things, data, things like that? And then also be conscious of your own experience. All of this feeds into our design approach, our design methodology. Think about perhaps this farmer. Here he is standing in his field. He might have been farming like this for generations. Maybe his grandfather did it like that, his father did it like that. Why would you change anything? Well, he's obviously asked himself some fundamental questions and thought about actually how each one of these elements might benefit from an evolution, a strategic investment, allowing the system to grow and develop. So he's understood that, look, these trees, which this cow is happily grazing on, look, they're protected. I can see that there's a fence around it. He's thought about the needs of the tree and the needs of the cow. By bringing those together, we're now getting a benefit. We've got another yield. We've got the trees producing fruits, trees providing habitat for birds and insects, and the cow is enjoying the shade and it's browsing from the tree. So we've stacked another element, another yield into the system, and actually we're helping the cow feed itself. So this is what we mean. And so imagine doing a survey on your own land, something that you're very familiar with. It's sometimes hard to see it in a sort of take the lenses off your eyes and see it afresh in a sort of a curious, inquisitive way. So we're going to do a site survey. I'm going to ask you to survey your site. Try and look at it afresh, see it like you've never seen it before. Can you make value-free, non-interpretive notes? Okay, so just record exactly how it is. So if we're starting our design process now, okay, I want to bring permaculture design to my land, to my garden, to my house, to my enterprise, to my business, to my community, whatever it is that we're bringing it to is, let's just make some observations and make some notes in a non-interpretive way of how is it now? Is the soil hard or soft? Is it compacted or is it loose? Is it fertile or is it low fertility? We don't have to have a reason. We can just observe that or record our observations. Nowadays with our smartphones, even if you don't have one yourself, there's usually someone in your community who does. You're able to take lots of photos, and you can shoot videos. You can record information with just on a voice recording as well, and store that. And actually, we're going to be asking you as you move through the PDC to do a site survey, and then to log the your observations on a web page, which we'll create for you. So that's a bit further down the line, but we'll be asking you to use these tools. These are our design tools. So you can try and make some speculations, ask some questions, try and understand what you're looking at, try and think about what was it like before, how might it go in the future, is there any local memory or local records or data that people you could ask, and try and understand, test out your ideas and your assumptions, and check the evidence. And then whatever strategies we're going to create, make sure that they're in line with the observations that you've made. So we're asking key questions and we're assembling the evidence, and then we're trying to confirm or deny whether we have understood what we're seeing. Deduction from nature. Right. I don't want to go too fast. I don't want to. I'm advancing this the narrative on a couple of different fronts. So the one hand is we're thinking about design. We're thinking about how we approach design, and I'm encouraging you to begin that process with observation of your site, observation of what's within it, analysis of the elements that are there, what are the inputs and outputs and the needs, and begin to assemble those ideas. And as chapter 3 of Bill Mollison books goes on, he brings us into this deduction from nature. And again, is what we're observing nature, we're asking questions, and we're asking what is it teaching us. Now in lesson 1 and lesson 2, we've made a lot of observations of natural systems. I'm going to there's some more to make from that. And this in this component here, we're thinking about what is nature teaching us when we're learning. Well, what we learn, here's the summary, and I'm going to give you lots of examples, and I'll keep repeating these terms so they become very, very familiar to you. And the principles of natural system is natural systems seek to catch and store energy. Plants create as much surface area as they can with their leaves to photosynthesize, and they use that energy very carefully, very strategically to interact with other species. We're going to talk about edge effect. We talk about diversity, stacking, this idea that natural systems are three-dimensional. We're going to talk about functions and elements. We're going to talk about how we support key functions with multiple elements, and we work with elements that in themselves perform multiple functions. We're going to be very sure that we're understanding in permaculture we design to function. So if our function is we need to make money, we need to grow food, we need to look after cows, we need to create a lot of biomass, those are our functions, and then we choose elements that fulfill those functions. I've used the word microclimate a lot in the early previous talks about how we can notice even very small and localized differences, and that can be very, very important. In fact, by working with microclimate, we can create diversity, and diversity is one of the goals of what we're trying to create in our systems to make them stable. I talked a lot about succession last week. We thought about how lichens give way to mosses, which give way to grasses and shrubs, which slowly evolve and end up as a forest. how nature has this process of succession. And this is something very much which we want to work with. And a reminder, this is permaculture, designing to create mutually beneficial relationships. We're really interested in this idea of symbiosis, symbiotic function, ways of operating which benefit both parties. And we're designing to create these mutually beneficial relationships. And these are the concepts we need to hold in mind, and these are the terms I want people to become very familiar with. I'll show you more examples, don't you worry. Bill's making us think quite hard. I'm just thinking this, but this methods of design. This is such a key building block to the permaculture process. So, and this will be a thread throughout the whole PDC of these design tools. So, design as a selection of options or pathways based on decisions. Design as a selection of options and pathways based on decisions. Have to make choices about the product or crops. We might make decisions about social investment, skills, occupations, education, processing or value adding on or off site, market availability, management skills. So if design is a process, if we can, as soon as if we what defines our next step is then defined by each one of these decisions as we move through or along these pathways. I'm also trying to think about design within limiting factors. So if we could create designs that begin with the resources that are already available to us, and then that process can then begin, rather than creating a design that we then need external inputs to even begin from. And once that process, that pathway has begun, we then start learning, and each decision flows on to the next one, and we're having to think about things in more deeper and longer term ways. So our choices of crops, our choices of investment, the skills and education that we might need lead us to how do we get the best value out of our produce, how do we bring that to market, and how do we manage that process. So I think there's a flow there again, as one step moves to the next. We can design by maps, and I will also encouraging you to create a simple map of if it's land, then a sort of a land-based map, or if it's a concept like a spider diagram, a relationship map. There are very simple and traditional ways of making maps. We can make models. We can pace things out. We'll talk about constructing in A-frames and how we measure contours and height. But of course, there's a lot of technology now, whether it's accessible to us or not. There's things like Google Earth. We can see overviews of, sometimes very detailed, depending on where we are. There are tools like Photoshop, which we can go into a computer environment and create lovely graphics. There are these flying drones now that have cameras that can actually make 3D models of your landscape. Imagine having the tools, the mapping tools, to be able to fly over your land and construct a 3D model like this. Because some complex design of water management over a whole landscape, we're going to need an accurate map. We're going to need to be able to measure it. And also, if we're going to collaborate with other people, we're going to be able to have a vision and share the steps of the development steps with other people so that we can obviously work together as a team. So I always advise we're going to start with something really small and really simple, but that these are the processes that we're going to go through, and and obviously as we tackle more and more longer term, more ambitious designs, and more resources to achieve that. There's a checklist for design considerations, and we're going to enlarge on what we mean by all of these. So again, I'm trying to think of there's so many different elements to consider agriculture. So we have a concept of zones. That zones move out in concentric circles. The closer to the home we are, the more intensive the activity can be, because we see it more, we interact with it more. And as we move further and further away, we get less feedback. We're less aware of what's going on. So we don't want to put high intensive, high interaction activities, far away. Sectors. So sectors are the transects of the zones. Gradient and slope, obviously landscape, the shape of the landscape affects how we can relate to it. Design considerations. We don't just want the random placement of elements. We want to design to build guilds, to understand that nothing exists in isolation. So whether we had the tree, the cow, the fence around the tree, the bird, maybe the insect, all of those elements we could see them as a guild. So we could allow niches to develop for each one of those elements to fulfill itself and find its place within our design. And we're going to keep coming with succession and to think about, firstly, is what's the order in which we might approach our design? What are the first things we want to do? What would the first changes we would make in the landscape? And also that idea of this natural succession, that if nature's enabled its own ability to progress and has its own sort of dynamic action. Right, okay. I'm gonna pause because this is really really good stuff from Bill. And I don't want to take you too far, just down one line. So I'm going to say we will take a very we're almost so we're going to take a very short break. And check for any questions or feedback. But there's our summary. What we have just done. I'll put my little advert up. What we have just done is had a little explore into the Bill Mollison's manual on how the methods of how we go about doing design. And what I'm going to take you to now is we'll just take a very, very quick break, and then we will come back from a permaculture perspective, and also from this idea where we're designing from the ground up. It's the soil matters. It's incredibly important, and that's good to be our primary. So I will pause the recording, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Okay. So let's do about 10 minutes and then get back at 5 past. Now we can all grab a glass of water or a cup of tea and then get back at 5 past. Because now it's 55, so 5 past. Thanks, Steve. Please don't go off. See you all back soon.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Aaron, Deborah, you're welcome to the second session.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to two of today's lectures. We're going to be looking at soil. We're going to talk about soil. Introduction to soil from a permaculture perspective. In our approaches to design, we've been reminded the only new energy coming in is from the sun. Only plants, or we rely on plants, are the most effective, efficient way of translating that solar energy into sugars, starches, and carbohydrates, the stuff of life. Plants grow in soil. Soil's important. We need to really understand it. We need to, let's have a bit of a dive into soil. So Pepper are the lectures where they keep reminding us about what is permaculture, different ways of encapsulating and describing it. These are the words of David Holmgren. He says, permaculture is a creative process based on whole systems thinking that uses ethics and design principles. It guides us to mimic the patterns and relationships we can find in nature and can be applied to all aspects of human habitation, from agriculture to ecological building, from appropriate technology to education, even economics. So look, actually, David's applying permaculture in a very broad way here, but he's saying it's a design process based on whole systems thinking and mimics the patterns and relationships we see in nature. Okay, soil. Patterns and relationships. This is a lovely illustration. I just found it on Google. It's bringing us down into soil. It's making us see that soil is a matrix of rock particles and roots and cavities, and it's a habitat. It's we're seeing mammals. There's a mole, there's a stoat eating beetles and arthropods. We're seeing a complexity of life and seeing how the worms move through the system, how they aerate and create pathways for other organisms. Here we look, if we expand a small section of the soil and really blow it up the scale, and looking on another level, we realize that there are worlds within worlds in soil. There's the things we can see, but there's the things that we can't see, and there's a great many of them. We need to become, if not familiar, but we need to know that they're there. We need to feel their presence because they're incredibly important. So it turns out. And actually, if we even to expand by another sort of scale of a logarithmic scale, is we look into even deeper, is for us it's another layer of life at an even more microscopic level. The fungal mycelium and bacterial communities, and actually the very building blocks of the soil ecosystem. So we think about the soil as an ecosystem. Remember what we said about ecosystems in the previous lecture, how they're dynamic, interconnected. They open up, they have niches, so think of these words that we've been using. So think about how, look, the presence of one organism has created a niche for another organism. And think about also how there are worlds within worlds operating within the soil. So remember, what was it? We want to mimic patterns and relationships we see in nature. So this is what we see in nature. And, of course, I'm inviting you to observe with critical eye, ask fundamental questions, go out and do those same observations for yourself. Ask naive questions. Allow yourself to sort of think outside of the box, to see things afresh. So, of course, the kind of soil that we might get would depend on the climate, on the conditions that soil is forming in. Soils build over long periods of time, so they're in interaction with the climate of where they're at, the place. And let's just say that climate, simplistically, let's think about it, is it's the relationship between heat and humidity. So on this side of this illustration, we move from hot to cold, from equatorial to to the Arctic, and we also move from wet to dry. So within those sort of variables, gives us many of the simplistic view. We're seeing the patterns, and so that we can understand the details better, we have a context for that detail. Now, here's another thought, though: is we can be in the wet equator, the humid tropics down here, and this the most potentially dynamic ecosystems on the planet are in the humid tropics. That you have the possibility to build the most complex, interconnected, three-dimensional systems. So there's a challenge for everyone in over in East Africa. But also, it's not just, it's as you go up. This is altitude as well. So if you go in the mountains, and as you move up in altitude, you would also go through all these same climate zones, and you will then find experience the different sort of soil types and vegetation types. So even if we are in the humid tropics, as we get climbing altitude, we will experience other conditions. This is much more like we're Western Europe, we're much more temperate systems. Things happen much more slowly. They're less extreme. There's kind of more humidity, more all year round, but we can also have temperate grasslands and temperate deserts as well, as a function of the availability of humidity. So as a landscape dries out, the forest moves away and is replaced by savanna. And or as the forest grows, it can colonize into the savanna. As it gets colder, you often end up with long-term coniferous system, evergreen trees. Think of the Canadian Shield, Scandinavia, Siberia. Huge realm of the Arctic Circle is taiga. This coniferous, and also birch, often going on for miles and miles and miles. And and you get a very specific set of conditions in the Arctic. The tundra, not something I'm particularly familiar with, but there you have a thing called permafrost, as in the ground remains frozen. So maybe just the surface, few inches, centimeters, might thaw in the summer months, and then you have sort of shallow-rooted plants, maybe tough woody, slow-growing vegetation as well that can take the benefit in the summer, but also survive perhaps over the winter. But obviously, as we get colder, things slow down. Everything happens much more slowly. So, interesting thing perhaps about being in the equatorial realms is things can build up very quickly and have a huge potential, but also things can break down very quickly, and problems can become really serious very quickly in the tropics as well. So all of these things we bear in mind in our design. What we expect to see from the soil, from the landscape, is in some way a function of where we're at, and then that's a relationship to climate. And the climatic factors is something which we explore as we go a little bit further into this. It's important to get this in mind and help us to understand the soils that we have and where we are, and why and how they might be different from each other. All interesting stuff. So also is simplistically, this is a transect across the valley. Here's the top of the hill, here's the valley bottom, and here's the top of the other side of the valley. we're asked to think about where we are in the landscape. We might get different kinds of soils and soil conditions depending whether we're on the hilltop. Often the soils are very thin, skeletal soils, maybe acidic. And as we move down the sides of the hill, we might have another set of conditions. And then at the bottom, perhaps where it's wetter, or perhaps where there's more fertility, and we might get another set of conditions. So where we are in the landscape, that we might help us understand. We get different soil conditions in different places. The other thing we can say is, in this diagram is, on the one side, it says permeable substrate. That means the bedrock, the underneath, is permeable. It allows water to flow through it. So, and again, is the permeability of the bedrock will again affect the kind of soils that you get. So this is observation, seeing the landscape, using your eyes, asking questions, observing it when it's hot, observing it when it's wet, observing it in different conditions, and beginning just to understand where we are in the system. We're seeing the patterns. Slowly from there, we can then understand the details. Okay, so soil and soil types, it might depend where we are climatically, where we are within a landscape, and the shape of that landscape. And then now let's get to the soil itself, and let's think about how its characteristics might change as we go deeper down. And we can imagine soil actually is layers, and at different layers, there's maybe slightly different things happening. And these are called soil horizons. And typically, there's an O horizon, where it says there, the living plants and plant debris, the stuff that's either alive or was alive, and it's very aerobic, and it's dark crumbly matter. It's got a fresh organic matter. All of that surface layer of the soil, and that's where there's so many interactions going on, so many microbes. But don't forget that what goes on the soil and the soil surface really needs to be cool. It needs to be shady. Soils form under long-term canopy, under trees, under pasture, they dry out and lose their carbon, oxidizes in the sunshine. So to maintain a good O horizon, the surface living part of the soil, we tend to use mulches. We copy from natural patterns, and that's mulches is dead organic matter lying on the surface of the soil to help protect it, reduce evaporation, increase shading, create habitat for the soil microdecomposers, microorganisms, and so forth. Let's go down a little bit deeper. And if we've got good cultivatable soil that's good for our vegetables and crops, is the A horizon. This is the darker colored, high in organic matter, lots of insects and worms and grubs and bacteria. That organic matter is being broken down, being made available to the roots materials. We've got 15 centimeters or 30 centimeters, I guess we've got 12 inches, 30 centimeters of A horizon soil. We can grow pretty much anything, and all sorts of possibilities there. So in permaculture, we might have strategies and techniques to enhance that A horizon of soil. That's why we're interested in kind of raised beds and other sort of techniques, but we'll get to that. This is the bit that is so important for cultivation, and it's because the life in the soil is, like us, is aerobic. They're organisms that breathe in air and breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So we want a soil that's rich in oxygen so that the beneficial organisms can maintain the fertility. And that's what's going on in the A horizon. go deeper down, the B horizon, it's lighter color because there's less carbon, coarser, rougher. It can be full of roots. And also we're going to think about how nutrients might leach down. The action of rainfall and water percolating down in the soil is nutrients can be washed from the higher layers and washed deeper down into the soil. So that can be a characteristic of the B horizon. In this illustration, we have the C horizon. That's weathered bedrock. So the bottom, the R layer, the R horizon, or the rock layer, that's the parent material. Usually that soil has formed over a long period of time, erosion, action of weathering, plants and living and dying, allows that soil to slowly develop, and it happens very, very slowly. And the more we look into and understand soil, the more we learn to value it and realize how incredibly special it is and how dependent we are on it. Okay, so soil horizons. Sometimes there's a gap between the B horizon and the C horizon, and depending on what the material are and the components are. And let's have a little look at that. So we're seeing patterns. Remember, we're not trying to get lost in the detail, but we're trying to understand that different soils are going to form different sort of climates and different kind of plants, but they're all potentially useful and they're all things that we can work with. Okay, but they have different challenges and opportunities. The kind of soils that we encounter will be different parts of the landscape, permeable or impermeable rocks, and all of these will be factors. And so as we go down, we might excavate or explore our soil, we might dig a pit or a hole to expose the horizons so that we can then learn and understand and see what we're working with. So here's 3 more patterns, basic models. Is the thing that I'm most familiar with is the sort of temperate soils, and what I just talked about in the previous illustration is there's our O horizon with all the life in it, humus accumulation. The A horizon, and you're saying how we've got a sort of a leach zone between the A and the B horizon, where over time certain nutrients will accumulate much deeper down through just gravity and water, obviously, will carry them down. And that's where we begin to learn to value the deeper rooted plants that plants might contribute to, as an element within a guild of mutually beneficial plants, is deeper rooted plants that can mine and access minerals that have been washed down and then bring them back to the surface again. And that plants can be obviously harvested, composted, fed to animals, and there's nutrients then return to the surface again. In tropical systems, everything's happens so much faster. So generally what we see is that there isn't much of an O horizon, because that matter is breaking down so quickly, and there's a very shallow A horizon. And that interesting contrast between temperate, something we might see more in Europe, and tropical, something we might see more in Uganda or Kenya, is in the temperate system, the majority of the nutrients, 2/3 of the available, if you like, life, the nutrient that's in the system, is in the soil at any one time, and only a third, approximately, rough, to get a sense of proportion, is in the canopy, the trees, the insects, the birds, a living part of the system. The tropical system, it's definitely the other way around. A lot more of the components in the system are held in the living matter, in the trees, the birds, the monkeys, the butterflies, everything else. And therefore, there's a reflection that there's much less of an A horizon. And there's another thing that happens in tropical systems is we have intense seasonal downpours of rain, which also has an effect to leach materials deeper down into the soil. And also we have hyper-arid desert systems where there's no A horizon, or the A horizon is rainfall is so low that no O horizon forms and soluble minerals accumulate in the B horizon. Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of leaching going on. But here's an interesting thing. In all of these three types of soils, all the nutrients that you need are potentially there. And all soils can be worked with and improved. And well, that's where we're going with this. This is where we're understanding the patterns, understanding the generality first, so that when we go out and make our observations in the field, we begin to recognize what we're seeing. Okay, and then we understand what we're working with. Now, I've touched on this already. A quick revision. On land, as a forest matures, it sucks down a huge volume of carbon, most of which over time is returned to the atmosphere. And so obviously is our and the bigger the carbon buildup in the soil, the greater the ability of that ecosystem to contain and hold more life. So there's real advantages in understanding the processes of how trees live and die, and how carbon in time translocates from the surface, where it's in active exchange with the atmosphere, to be deeper and deeper down in the lower soil horizons, where then there can be more air, more water retention, more possibility for microbes, and more interactions that keep mineral nutrients and leachates, that keep them in circulation. So as we move into through permaculture thinking, we're trying to think about ways in which this is a long-term design consideration, is that ways in which we can translocate carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil. Now, yeah, it's good for the climate problem in the long term, and if millions or billions of farmers could be doing that, that would be great. But in the short term, it's in your own benefit. It's to the long-term benefit of the soils. In fact, that's a great measure of whether what you're doing is truly sustainable. Is, are you building soil? Is the carbon in your soil rising? And that's a useful measurement to see about, whether you're having a long-term beneficial effect. Now, to typify and understand soils, this is the USDA classification of soil types, and we use these words to describe types of soil. We say it's a sandy soil, it's a silt soil, it's a clay soil, it's a loam soil. These are words that we might use, and these that we're describing the A horizon. We're describing that the active part, that part that's really nourishing our plants. That's the bit we're most interested in. If we go deeper down, usually we find clay because they're smaller particles. But so yes, what are these words saying? This is a standard diagram. You'll see this in lots of soil textbooks. It's saying as if your soil is 100% clay particles, then we've got to think about what the characteristics of that be. Okay, we have yes, Simon, please. You had a question. Do you unmute if you have a question, Simon?
Yes, sir. This is Simon Peter from Apad, eastern part of Uganda, under Tapa.
You're very welcome.
Yes, the members here, yes, members here want to understand what exactly soil is. Hello?
Hello, sorry, I was muted. That's a very good question.
Yes.
How would you describe it? What do you feel? What is soil? What's it made of?
Yes.
Okay, let's jump ahead. Soil is made of a bunch of things. Let's I'm gonna say
Simon, could you please mute?
thank you. Okay, thank you for the question. I want to just slow down a bit and really try and bring it alive, bring this point. So soil is alive. I want you to think of that, or there's the soil that's fertile, the soil that you're going to work with, it comes alive if you look after it. So it's rock particles. We can see in this picture that soil, the origins of soil are particles of rock. And those rock, they've broken down into pieces, and the size of those particles really gives a flavor. It sets the type of soil that you have. And we've used these three words: clay, silt, and sand. And they refer to the size of the particle, the mineral particle, the bits of rock that your soil is made out of. And if it's a sandy soil, the particles are big. They're very big. And you know that if you rub it in your hand, you feel it scratching. We all know what that sandy feeling is. Well, and clay is the opposite. Clay particles are tiny, absolutely tiny. Clay particles are so small that when you squidge them together, they become watertight because there's no gaps between them. So the mineral particles, these rock particles that are part of your soil, give it its characteristics. So the first thing we're going to think about soil is how big are the pieces of the mineral part, the rock components. Is it stony? Is it pebbly? And there's official words and measurements for rock particles. So if you want to know that, a fine clay is less than 0.002 millimeters. So you think that's very, very fine. Clay is, and then it grades up. Gravel, cobblestones, boulders. Okay, so there's words for it. But here, how we can visualize that is clay particles are really, really super small. Sand particles very much bigger. So a soil that's sandy is going to be better free draining, isn't it? There's going to be more air spaces in it. A clay soil tends to be much heavier, and it's harder for the water to drain into it. Now, I'll just jump between these pictures because this is what healthy topsoil might be made of. Again, this is a generality, it's a pattern. Obviously, it will vary. We've talked about all the other different variables. But of really healthy soil, the stuff that you're growing your best vegetables in, it's about half minerals. It's half rocks. It's half those particles. And whether it's a sandy soil or a silty or a clay soil will give it its characteristics. Or it might be a mixture. That's what that other graph was. Obviously, you often end up with a mixture of different particle sizes. But healthy soil is 50% air. Look at that. There's 25% air and 25% air spaces that water can flow into. And approximately 5% of your good healthy soil is organic matter. There's living organisms, there's the roots, living and dead, and then there's the humus. And humus is the sticky black stuff. You know, that's when as the organic matter that's in the soil breaks down, it moves from being dead organic matter to being humus. Humus is that long-term breakdown where it's interacted with fungi and bacteria. Humus is the glue that sticks soil, those mineral particles together. So another thing we can say is a really healthy soil has a crumb structure. It's actually that the worm castings, the fungi, the other organisms, the bacteria actually stick the particles together. Here's another way of understanding, thinking about that. Let's go back to our soil diagram and imagine that in this soil here, there's an enormous number of microbes, of little microorganisms. Some of those are bacteria. Now, as that bacteria is living away in the soil, it's in danger of being washed out. Imagine when the heavy rainfall comes, it's going to wash the nutrients through the soil, wash away the bacteria. So what they do is they exude a glue, and they aggregate, they stick the soil particles together with the glue, and what then they create on a really microscopic level. They create the conditions that they need. So as your soil becomes more alive, it becomes more crummy. These individual particles, whether it's clay, silt, or sand, become kind of joined together and become crumbly. Now, let me just get to, I don't know, I've got some pictures. Have I? Yes, look in this, if we just jump here to this slide here, this is some compost that I've made, and we can see how it's got that sort of crumbly texture, and that's the action of all of the different microbes that work together to create something that's much more valuable and interesting and useful. So working with nature. So these are the rules that we begin to learn, which is that we don't want to stand on our soil. We want to create, and this is another reason why we might be interested in things like raised beds, is if we remove the A horizon soil from the path and put that on top of the area that we want to cultivate, we now have a deeper soil. And we can protect that soil by using dead organic matter on the surface. And we're now starting to emulate natural systems to enhance the soil, to support the life in the soil. So if we don't stand on the soil, then here's another thing to think about. And let's go right back to the beginning, because I like this picture, is all of these organisms, even these microscopic organisms, even the fungi that's in the soil, it's aerobic. It, like you, breathes in oxygen, breathes out CO2. So all of this life in the soil, all of these organisms, as they're passing through the soil, they're opening up, they're opening channels. They're allowing both air and water to penetrate deep down into the soil. This is what we want. This is how when this rainfall moisture can get deep down and stay in the soil a long time. So we want to team up with all of the life in the soil, and one of the ways we want to do that is to not compress the soil. So here's a real rule: is don't stand on your soil, don't compact it, don't push out the air, because you'll slow down all that life. It's essential stuff. What is soil? It's, it, as you look after it, it slowly comes alive. There's a really simple test we can do. We can get a jam jar or a plastic water bottle or something like that, and we can take a sample of our A horizon soil and fill the bottle about a third full with the soil, top it about 2/3 full with water, give it a really good shake, really shake it up, allow everything to circulate around, and then stand it on a level surface and observe. And if there's any larger stones, grit, obviously bigger particles, they'll immediately fall out at the bottom. The heaviest particles obviously fall out first. And then the sand will be next, silt, and then clay. The clay particles might stay in suspension, for a day or two. If they're really small and really fine, the water might stay muddy for quite a long time, and eventually that will sediment out. Now, and looking at that will give you, and then there'll be actually organic matter. There'll be some organic matter which will sit on top of the clay. It'll float around a bit. Then you'll have clear water, and then you might have a few twigs or something like that floating on the top. So this very simple jam jar test gives us a feel of what our soil is like, of the relation, the proportion of the larger and smaller particles. And if it's really a clay, it'll just stay muddy for a long time. It's all good. So here, going back to this diagram, all this is saying is we can have a language to describe soils. So one in which there's a very high, the relationship between the particle sizes. But the bit that we want to know about is this sweet spot in the middle. And that's a loam soil. And that's when it's really beautifully mixed up together. And how does the soil get beautifully mixed up together? Is by the life that's in the soil. The more the worms, the insects, or any other organisms within the system, the more they interact, then the more they actually are tunneling and opening up the soil. I sometimes think about it like baking a cake or bread. If you just get the conditions right, it all bubbles up and rises. Well, your soil will do that. If you do minimum till, try not to disturb it. Try techniques that allow the soil to develop over time. So what is soil? Well, it's a mixture of rock particles, and then a bunch of organic matter. Now, a very important part of that organic matter is the organisms living in the soil. Sometimes we call that the soil biota. And you're reminded that most of that soil biota is microscopic. We can't see it. But we can know that it's there because we can see how the soil becomes crummy, it becomes open, it becomes more oxygenated. All of those things are just signs of life in the soil. And we talk about nutrients and plants need nutrients, but really the nutrients are the soil microbes. They're made out of all of the NPK, the manganese, the calcium, all the minerals that plants need are also contained within those microbes. So let's dive right. And again, stop me. I appreciate the question, and I'm very happy to move at the speed at which people are happy. Now, use some of the terms and ideas that we've been talking about in our design approaches. Let's think about the soil as an ecosystem. It's not a dead thing, it's a live thing. Ecosystems are dynamic, they're moving, they're interconnected. They're those things that we talked about previously. Let's begin to think about soil as an ecosystem, a dynamic, living, interconnected, three-dimensional thing that has niches within it. And as those niches develop, there's a process of evolution, and it becomes increasingly complex. We've talked about succession, how moving from bare rock to forest, and let's think about how we really, especially as farmers and growers, we're very interested in the process of how soil develops. Okay, so soil is an ecosystem. Let's explore it and think about it in terms of trophic levels, energy levels. That's that pyramid diagram that we saw earlier. So the only new energy coming into the system is coming from where? It's coming from the sun. So there's going to be the most biomass, there's going to be the most volume of material, is going to be the plants, living plants, and obviously the dead plants, and the above ground plant and the root structures as well. Both very, very important. Both of that represents part of the biomass yield of the plant. And that's basically molecules assembled together by using energy of sun, water, and carbon to create plants and sugars. Trophic level is always photosynthesizers. They're using the energy of the sun, photo, to synthesize, to build things. And plants, depending on the plant, as plants get more complex and longer living, they start to build relationships around their root tips. And they do that by pushing some of the sugars, some of the energy that they create in their leaves, in their chlorophyll. Then it comes down deep into the roots, and the plants give off those as exudates, as the X as in out of. So they're feeding on the outside of the roots. They start feeding bacteria and fungi. And there are also little nematodes, microscopic worms that feed on the roots and build relationships and feed on the fungi and bacteria. And there's two kinds of fungi. When we think of fungi, we usually think of mushrooms and think of that, the fruiting body, the thing that generates the spores. But of course, fungi really is the mycelial net, these little strands that grow through the thing that the fungi is digesting. So there's two kinds of soil fungi here. There are, where is it going to get its energy from? So the fungi is either going to get its energy from by being saprophytic, it's going to eat dead things. So fungi digest dead plants and dead matter, or they are mycorrhizal fungi. And rhizo means roots. We're going to be using that word a lot. The rhizosphere, the root and root relationships. So these amazing, amazing fungi that build relationships with plant roots and exchange sugars and for minerals, or minerals from sugars for sugars. The sugars coming from the plant, the minerals come from the fungi. So many, many plants build mutually beneficial relationships, symbiotic relationships through their roots with soil fungi. And that is the second trophic level. So plants are beginning to access the minerals that they need by trading sugars to this trophic level, this first layer. Now, this then has a relationship then to the next layer of our trophic pyramid, where there are types of organisms which we might call protozoa. There are amoeba, flagellates, ciliates. It doesn't matter what they're called, but these are bigger. These are like an order of magnitude bigger. And what these kind of things, amoeba, do is that they can surround colonies of bacteria and yeast and digest them. And what's interesting is, as they do that, and they digest them and they break them down and obviously give off their own digest states, that is plant food. And that as these lower organisms are predated on and digested and eaten, those nutrients then become available back to the plants. And then, of course, then we get to the fourth trophic level, where there are larger worms, predator worms, larger insects, arthropods, jointed bodies, insect types, things, and again, which in turn are fed on, predated on themselves by birds and other animals. So, what is soil? Soil is an ecosystem with at least 5 trophic levels. And when you have 5 trophic levels of activities in your soil, you're never short of nutrients, because the minerals that might be inert, there might be minerals in your soil, but the plants can't access them. They need to build relationships with all of these other organisms. And I don't know what they're all called. We can get microscopes. We can know they're there. We can go away and we can do science. We can pay to have tests done. We can look down microscopes. We can identify them. But also, as we can begin to learn what healthy soil looks like, what healthy soil feels like, what healthy soil smells like, what healthy soil tastes like. And we know that if we're seeing these higher organisms, higher animals, we've got a mole that looks like, and birds, as if they're keeping busy and they've got plenty to eat, you can be sure that the other lower levels are there. Depleted ecosystems, ones that aren't functioning soil ecosystems, ones, if they only have the bacteria and the fungi and they don't have the higher levels, is plants can't grow in that. That's not enough. And what's happened is, with farming systems, is we've lost the complexity of the soil because we've plowed it. We've lost the complexity of the soil because we've allowed it to dry out. We've lost the complexity of the soil because we've compacted it. We've lost the complexity of the soil because we've simplified the vegetation that was growing on it. We've lost the simplicity, the complexity of the soil because of many, many reasons. And as much as we can then understand that that's the problem, we can also then understand that the solution is to go back to working with the biology. This biology brings the soil back to life. And if we create the right conditions, these organisms will turn up. You don't need to go away and find them. If you like, they're potentially everywhere. All we need to do is to create the right conditions. Okay. So we're thinking about soil as an ecosystem, understanding that the soil biota, the living part of the soil, that's the difference between it just being rock, between it being dead and alive. It's this stuff. It's these organisms. And these organisms all need air. They all need to have a rich, a moist and aerobic environment. And once they have that, then the nutrients start cycling more and more readily and become more and more available to the plants. Think about the proportion of what we have. If it's just a compacted mineral particles with no air and no water, then it's not soil. And only becomes soil when it has this magic component that brings it alive. These different trophic levels of organisms that combine together to create an ecosystem that has these many niches within it and which maintains a long-term fertility of your soil. the soil food web. So really take this on board. This is something we will be referring back to. This is the building block within the soil that we're partnering with. So here's a nice illustration, kind of gives a slightly three-dimensional way again of seeing soil and seeing how it's a place where things can come together. Different niches, different habitats. So look how in this soil we can see here's the root of the plant, and here's the root hairs, as delicate side shoots, which greatly increase the surface area of the plant, so the plant can interact with the life in the soil. See how water is there suspended in droplets. So there's moisture in the soil, but there's also air. This is really key. We want that it needs to be both. And look how between these, the mineral particles, between the roots and the mineral particles, there's spaces. Yes, there's moisture, but there's spaces. And in these little pores is the opportunity there for the soil life to take hold. Okay, I'm gonna, Tapper, please do share your question.
Yes, sir. Now, focusing on issue of soil, but here is a scenario where a farmer who uses poor farming, yes, this is a scenario where a poor farmer is using poor methods of farming, and eventually he destroys all macro and micro living organisms in the soil. How can that farmer reorganize back those organisms into the soil?
Thank you very much for that question. That's a super question. If we've damaged our soil so much that we're just mineral particles, we've just got, if you like you say, that the life has gone away, then we're going to need to do some work. We're going to need to do some investment of effort. And actually, there's a range of strategies of what we can do. And I'm going to answer your question, but in a couple of slides' time. So allow me to go more slowly, and I'll get you to that point before the end of the lesson. The answer is you're going to make compost, and you're also going to think about how to bring the life back into the soil, which means incorporating the air and water again. So, okay. These I'm going to go through these 2 or 3 slides and carry on the topic of the life in the soil. So as we improve the conditions of the soil. So one way that we might improve our soil when it's been really degraded is we might plant a crop, which we might call it a green manure. It's a kind of crop that we grow to feed the soil, not for any other purpose. So we might grow it and even dig it back in, or cut it down and mulch it back in. Some crops that are good to grow as green manures are the legume family of plants, which are plants like in the pea and bean family, but they fix nitrogen. They're one of those plants that, if you like, they work very hard at feeding the soil biota, life in the soil. So there's a technique. And if you manage your soil very carefully, so maybe you've grown a green manure crop, a sacrificial crop to feed the soil, and so those roots of that crop will help open up the soil and maybe allow a bit of moisture, allow some air in there, and allow these little spaces to form where bacterial communities can take hold, where those associations that we talked about, the microbial level can start to happen. We need to create the right conditions. And then it will slowly, actually quite quickly, start to improve. So especially in the tropics, if you get it right, things develop quite quickly too. So this is obviously this is a picture. We've seen some drawings of these things. Here's an actual slide of these are the rock particles. And look, they have little cracks and fissures in them. These are the mineral particles of the soil. And in these little cracks, there's space there for life to form. And looks like some amoeba that's being predated on. There's an amoeba there, farming bacteria. We've got some decomposing plant cells. We're seeing different kinds of, these are fungal hyphae. And what happens is that these organic particles start knitting everything together. And the action of these little microbes within it is the fertility entering back into your soil. So these are mycorrhizal fungi. These are the fungi. This white web here this is the fungi, and this is fused onto, you see the yellow roots of this little pine tree. Now we have to create the right conditions for these associations to happen. One of the ways that we can try multiplying populations of key species. Earthworms are habitat builders. Earthworms accelerate decomposition and soil building. There's many different kinds of earthworm. There's ones that go sort of up and down, vertical feeders. They bring organic matter from the surface deeper down. They process that, and they're actually digesting. They allow soil particles to go through their bodies, and actually digesting the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil, and in the process opening up and aerating it. These ones in the middle, these are compost worms. These live in decomposing matter. And if you create a big pile of decomposing matter, create the right conditions, aerobic, humid, moist, they will appear and they will multiply, and you can use both the action of the worms and the compost that they create to repair and build your soils. So if soils are being degraded, we can rebuild the biology with compost methods that I need to. I'm going to take you through our practicals in which we make really good compost. We will learn how we can make compost from woody material, how we can make compost from grasses, how we can make compost from animal manures, how we can have like green manure so we can grow the food for the soil, and how also we can combine these different things together. So if we're going to make compost, we need to understand a certain set of conditions, and we also need to do some observation. We need to go out, look around and ask ourselves, what materials are there available that we could use? And anything that has lived once before can live again. We can, through a composting process. So again, I think I can say to the tap out group is that when soil's been really degraded, our strategy is to get the life bit back into it, get the life going again. And one of the ways we can do that is by understanding that the conditions that soil life requires, and by creating those conditions. And I'm going to talk more about well, yeah, okay. So you got me out of sequence a little bit, but I want to get, there's a lot to say. It's a big subject, and I'm just bringing you into it, really. So, you know, you can go out and buy mycorrhizal fungi. You can this if this looking under at an electron microscope. This is absolutely microscopic. These little fungal hyphae in this picture may be only 1 cell thick. They're absolutely microscopic, but you can actually inoculate your soil with these fungi and promote them, and they will then fuse with the roots of the plants. And which greatly improve the ability of that plant to extract nutrients from the soil and to build relationships with the soil microbes, because that's what's happening. Now, you might not be in a position to go off and buy these things, but you can begin to understand that many plants have these associations, and that these organisms are present, if not on your land, but on the edges, around, or the spores of fungi are everywhere because they're microscopic. They blow on the wind. Really, what you have to do is to create the right conditions. And we're going with it. Yeah. Okay. So I've tried to answer your question, but actually. And I appreciate that we want to get to these points as early as we can, because this is vital. But at the same time, for the depth of understanding I want to take you slowly through these steps so that we can feel that now we've really beginning to understand what soil is and what's going on with it, and that how that understanding really sits within our understanding of permaculture, because everything on land begins in soil, and soil is this complex living matrix of, yes, it's lots of stones and minerals, but it's so much more than that, because in fact it's creating a home where dead stuff becomes live stuff again. That there's this amazing transition going on within the soil from decaying organic matter, and then it's processed by fungi and bacteria into nutrients, which have then become plant available. So I'm just scrolling through these. We're just trying to summary of, we thought about these soil horizons. So, using observation, we can understand our soil, ask ourselves those fundamental questions. Is, what is it like? Can we describe it? What does it feel like? Is it wet or is it dry? Is it hard or is it soft? Is it, understand its characteristics, and then begin to think about how we can work with it, how we can translocate carbon from the atmosphere to deeper down into that soil, to open it up so that it can hold more moisture, hold more air, and allow those soil microbes and all of those organisms to get busy and bring it to life for you. That's our sort of strategy, and we're going to be showing you specific and more detailed examples as we move further forward into this. So next week, under the theme of catch and store energy, we'll look at some of those techniques. So things I want you to think about this week is, we're moving from observe and interact to catch and store energy. We want to understand that soil, in many ways, soil is a store of energy. Think of how it's full of all that organic matter, which is slowly being translated back into plant available nutrients. It reminded, in this picture, that as we're more temperate, or we go higher up into the mountains, that the nutrients hang around in the O and A horizon longer. In the tropics, they move around much more quickly. So therefore, it's much more important to maintain, or it's very important to maintain tree cover, to use nitrogen fixing plants, shade plants, living mulches and dead mulches to keep that surface of the soil protected. And think about also to Tapper, in terms of your question, think about the succession in which you might allow soil to be slowly rebuilt, that process of succession that we talked about. Yeah, you can download this slideshow. It's available for everyone to share. And I'm trying to bring these subjects to life for us. And think about this. Again, this is an ongoing conversation. I hope you're now getting this idea of soil as a living matrix of air and water and open spaces around mineral particles. And it's in those gaps that everything lives. And it's all held together by an amazing matrix of fungal mycelium. And, leading mycologist Paul Stamets once said in one of his lectures, he said, there's 8 miles of mycelium in a cubic inch of soil. So one of the ways to allow soil to repair is to don't damage it. Don't keep digging it. Don't keep compressing it. Keep it covered, feed it, allow it a chance to come alive, and allow that fungal mycelium to start to regrow. It will start to come back to life. Whilst we're doing observing, we could make some generalities about earthworms. We know they're important. There's 3 or 4 different kinds of types of worm that live in slightly different ways. It's interesting to observe and see what you might have. There are, I only learned this word yesterday, anesic worms, vertical feeders. Those type of worms that bring organic matter down from the surface, deeper down to the soil, open up air channels and water channels. Those are very important. There are compost worms. They live in a decaying organic matter. There are also endogenic. There are horizontal feeders. So there's worms that go that way and there's worms that go that way. So you can imagine how between these different types of worms, there's lots of species in these types as well, how that helps develop the soil, spread nutrients, create passageways for roots, for microbes, for fungi to follow. And there's also root-dwelling worms living very, very close in relationship to the roots of plants. So types of worms, recognizing patterns, recognizing that each one of these types of worms might contribute to the fertility, to the function of your living system in a slightly different way. Permaculture, we learn to value the diversity, understand that all of these species and somehow are contributing to the long-term health and fertility of our soil. Now, I don't know how clear this slide is. I think this is very interesting and illustrating. It's about soil compaction. So we have a maize seedling in each test tube, and they've all been grown for the same amount of time. And the only difference is on the right one, the soil is compacted. High compaction, medium compaction, and low compaction. And look, in the soil that's got, by compaction, it means how much the air is being pushed out. So in this one, it's got much more air. The only difference between the 3 is the amount of air between the soil particles. And you can see how on this one it's significantly better, and we've got much more root development. It's going much deeper down into the test tube. So therefore that plant's going to be able to access much more nutrient, much more water. Some of those water and nutrients will be washed down deeper into the soil as well. So this plant's going to benefit in many different ways from less compacted soil. So in coming weeks, we're going to think about techniques and discuss ways in which we can design, ways in which we can plan our activities and gardens and so forth, in the ways in which we can work with nature, work with the soil, understand the value of this soil food web of these many different organisms living together, collaborating to maintain your soil fertility. Now, we can get into some really interesting stuff in the next few weeks. And I'm only just going to start touching on this, but as your soil becomes more healthy, becomes more alive, the plants that are growing in it are able to grow much more successfully. They're able to access more nutrients and to photosynthesize more efficiently. All of these things, it turns out, makes a big difference, because guess what? Healthy plants resist pest attack. And in fact, if things like these sap-sucking aphids attack a healthy plant, they're killed by it, because they can't actually. Plant pests and diseases always attack the weakest plant, and if your soil is really healthy and your plants are really healthy, and by your soil being healthy, I mean the microbiology, the soil biome, microbiome, soil biota, I used that word before, then the healthier plants, the better they are at resisting pest attack. And if you can make your soil healthy enough, really strong, then nothing can attack your plants. And this is a very, very interesting, and I'm going to introduce you to bricks testing, the measurement of which we can tell plant health, and I'm also going to introduce you to techniques to enhance the life in your soil. So I've just spent the last few minutes perhaps just warming up. I'm going to stop in just a few minutes' time. A little bit from my life experience is I've cultivate this image here is a community garden center, community garden. Created, it's actually in a suburban environment, and it's a permaculture demonstration, education, training center, community center, drop-in place. And the idea was to bring people together around growing food, cultivating. And this is just a mural that was drawn on the side of one of the buildings, just a really nice drawing. And maybe the message we wanted to convey to people who were coming to our community centre was to think about the interconnectedness, the relationship of life in the soil, between the tree. We look at the insects, the worms, the bugs, the microbes. That this is, and in some way, that's also all these different niches created by these elements in this ecosystem. There's room for us in there. There's our invite, is to ask, how do we fit ourselves into that? How do we integrate into this system? That's what we want to do. And we want to use organic techniques, simple things, but to accelerate decomposition in a way in which we create really good compost, in which we learn to use the materials around us, to work with, look at these little arthropods, digesting this cardboard, building it into soil. Who are our partners? Who are we going to work with? What materials do we have around? Can we start to create conditions in which we're building soil, in which we're favoring the life in the soil, so that we can have highly productive systems that don't require lots and lots of work? So look, in these are a couple of growing systems that I've played with. This was expensive. This is constructed with timber. There's a raised bed system using compost, all the techniques we're talking about. But this is a training center, high volume of people come through there, and it's important what it looks like. So we had more resources to invest. Here's one, a community garden. This is a living mulch. We're creating different soil conditions here to support fruit trees which are growing, and we've used a different set of techniques. But you get the soil right, and everything else follows. And then you start, and once you've got things moving in the right direction, and you can raise your fertility every season, you improve the carbon content of your soil every year. You keep it covered with either living plants or dead plants or a succession of both. Feed it with compost. You get fantastic results. And that's where we're going. And I thank everybody for your attention this week. I think I'm sort of finding the pattern. I think we'll about two lectures in a sort of a 3 hours, and I'll record them and post them so that you can always catch up in your own time, and obviously if there's connection problems. So there we go. I'm going to stop recording. So that's the end of the formal content.
Thanks, Steve.